Petra Dunmore was 21 years old, and she had $14.60 to her name, a draw knife in a canvas bag, and a deed to a property that the County of Grey had stopped acknowledging in the year 1901. The solicitor who told her this, a thin man named Mr. Addison Farr, who kept his office in a building on Dunlop Street in Barry and smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, did not say it with any particular ceremony. He read from the file, he slid the papers across the desk, and he told her that the property known as Cold Ash Landing had been removed from the county roll more than 2 decades ago, that it would take some doing to establish whether the deed still held legal weight, and that she was, in any case, entitled to go and look at it. What Mr. Addison Farr did not tell her, because he did not know, was that Cold Ash Landing had been removed from every map for a reason, and that reason had been waiting a very long time for someone to come and find it. Settle in with us for a little while. If you're watching from somewhere across this country tonight, leave us a comment below and tell us where. We read everyone. This is a story that takes its time, the way the best ones do. Petra had been born in a rented house in Owen Sound, the only child of a father who worked the lake boats and a mother who had been born Eleanor Gilchrist, of a family that had farmed the county's gray limestone ridges since before Confederation. Her father drowned in Georgian Bay when she was 9, in a November squall that came up fast on a crossing, and her mother was gone 4 years later of a chest illness that no doctor in that part of the county could do much about, and no family had the money to treat properly. After that, Petra went to her father's younger sister, a woman named Petra Dunmore, who ran a rooming house on the edge of town and had strong opinions about what a girl owed for her keep. Petra was not cruel in any dramatic way. She fed Petra, clothed her in things left behind by former boarders, and set her to work at 10-years-old cleaning rooms and scrubbing stairs and carrying coal up from the cellar. She made it plain in dozens of small ways that Petra's presence in the house was a calculation, not a choice, and that sentiment was a luxury neither of them could afford. The person who changed that was a woman named Rowena Gilchrist, who lived alone in a stone house 3 streets away and had learned coopering from her husband before he died, and then gone on practicing it because she found she was better at it than he had been. Rowena was 64 when Petra was 11. She had no children and no particular softness about her, but she had a kind of attention that most people never turn toward a child. The kind that takes in what is actually there rather than what is convenient to see. She had known Petra's mother by name and by the Gilchrist family connection, and she noticed Petra the way a person notices a sound that doesn't quite fit the expected pattern, and she did something about it. She knocked on Petra Dunmore's door one October morning and offered to take the girl on as a helper in her workshop 2 afternoons a week. For a small wage she would pay directly to Petra and not to Petra. Petra agreed because 2 afternoons was 2 suppers she didn't have to account for. She did not ask what kind of workshop it was. What Rowena Gilchrist taught Petra over the next 7 years was coopering, the making of barrels and casks, hogsheads and churns, firkins and butter tubs, and everything coopering requires. She taught her to read the grain of stave wood, white oak and red oak and ash, and to know by the smell whether a timber had been properly seasoned. She taught her to set a crows and drive a hoop and test the bilge of a cask by running her palm along the belly to feel where the wood had sprung. She taught her to use a draw knife on a shaving horse, pulling the blade toward herself in long, clean strokes to thin a stave from rough-cut plank to the exact bevel the curve needed, and to feel the moment when the wood was right, not by measuring, but by listening to what the blade said as it moved. She taught her other things too. To keep her own accounts in a small notebook, always in 2 columns. To read a legal description and match it to a plat. To say plainly what she needed and expect it to be heard. To look at a broken thing long enough to understand what it was telling her before deciding what to do about it. The draw knife had belonged to Rowena's husband, Clement Gilchrist, a cooper who had worked a shop in Guelph before they married and moved north. It was a good tool, a Sheffield blade, 14 inches, with wooden handles wrapped at the grip in black linen tape and a small notch worn into the left handle where Clement had steadied it once against a nail head and cut the wood without meaning to. Rowena had used it beside her own tools for 30 years. The autumn Petra turned 17, she pressed it into Petra's hands at the end of an afternoon's work and said only that a good tool wants to be used by someone who knows how, and that Clement would have thought Petra's hands were fine hands for it. Petra kept it in the canvas bag she carried to and from the workshop from that day on. She took it out most mornings and ran a whetstone along the blade before she began work. Not because it always needed it, but because the habit of it settled her. Rowena died the spring Petra turned 19, of a series of small failings that added up quietly over one winter to something larger, the way a log dam loses its mortar one piece at a time before the whole thing gives. She left the workshop tools and the stone house to a nephew in Peterborough, who sold both within 6 weeks. Petra was given the draw knife, which was already hers, and $40 Rowena had set aside in a coffee tin and told by the nephew that there was nothing further. She went back to Merle's rooming house. She worked the way Rowena had taught her to work, thoroughly and without complaint, and she saved what she could. Which was not much, because Merle's accounting of what Petra owed for room and board was, like Merle herself, very precise in ways that always happened to favor Merle. She did not know, in those 2 years, that anyone in the world was thinking about her. She did not know that a letter had been posted from a solicitor's office in Barry, addressed to her by name, in late summer, and that Merle's had signed for it and placed it in the sideboard drawer beneath the good tablecloths, and left it there for 8 weeks, because Merle had already decided that anything addressed to Petra was either irrelevant or inconvenient, and she preferred her conclusions to arrive before the evidence. Petra found it on a Wednesday in October when she was sent to fetch a candle stub. She read it standing at the sideboard with the drawer still open, and she understood before the second page that a man named Amos Gilchrist, her mother's uncle, a man Petra had heard mentioned once or twice as someone who had gone north to Homestead and never properly come back, had died intestate in a rooming house in Guelph the previous spring. That after many months of tracing, Mr. Addison Farr of Barry had identified Petra Dunmore as the next person with any legal claim to what remained of the estate. A cooperage, a cottage, and 4 acres of creek bottom in the county of Grey, known as Cold Ash Landing. A place the county had ceased to recognize in 1901, and that no current survey map showed, but to which the original deed filed in the provincial archives still attached. She folded the letter. She put it in her pocket. She closed the drawer, and finished the errand, and went about the rest of the evening as though nothing had happened. That was how Rowena would have done it. She kept the letter in her pocket for 5 days. In those 5 days she did nothing that would have looked to Merle or to the boarders unusual. She cleaned the 3 upstairs rooms on Thursday. She repaired the banister post on Friday with a screw, and a block of oak cut from offcuts she'd kept from Rowena's workshop. She ironed shirts on Saturday morning, and while she ironed them, she thought about what she would need, and what she could carry, and what she was willing to leave. On Saturday afternoon, she walked to the post office and sent a letter to Mr. Addison Farr. His reply came in 10 days. Bring yourself and whatever papers you have. He would do the rest. She counted her money the night before she left. $14.60, rolled in a strip of cloth inside the bottom of her canvas bag, underneath the draw knife. On the morning of a Thursday in November, she came downstairs early. She made the coffee and laid the breakfast out on the sideboard. Plates warmed, butter cold from the window shelf, salt in the cellars. Then she went into the front room, where Merle was reading the Methodist Recorder, and told her plainly that she was leaving on the morning coach and that she had business in Barry and would not be coming back. Merle looked up after a moment and said that Petra owed for the last 2 weeks of board, and that she hoped she was not fool enough to think a dead man in Guelph had left her anything worth the fare north. Petra set $4 on the side table beside Merle's teacup, which was what 2 weeks at the rate Merle had always named came to if you calculated it honestly, and picked up her canvas bag and walked out the front door and down the steps without turning around. She was 21 years old. She had $10.60, a draw knife, a letter, and a long way to go. She did not look back at the rooming house. She did not slow her step on the frozen road until she reached the corner where the coach stopped, and the driver, a large, quiet man named Mr. Hector Breen, who had known her father, tipped his cap and told her the fare to Barry was $3. She thanked him. She paid. She sat inside the coach with the bag on her lap and her feet pressed against it, and she did not speak to the other passengers, and she was in Barry by early afternoon. Mr. Addison Farr saw her that same day. He filed the necessary papers, gave her a copy of the deed, and told her that Cold Ash Landing was approximately 40 miles north and east, accessible by rail, as far as a flag stop called Canallan, and from Canallan on foot, or by whatever cart she could arrange. He said he did not know the current state of the property. It had not been assessed since 1901. She found a boarding house near the station, spent one night, 75 cents, which she considered carefully before paying, and took the morning train north. The train ran through country that went from farmland to mixed forest to something wilder and lower, with granite showing through the tree roots and frozen creek beds flashing between the spruce. The sky was a hard pale gray. She ate bread from her bag and watched the country pass and did not think about Owen Sound. Canallen was a platform and a grain shed and a water tower. She stepped down into wind that smelled of pine resin and cold iron. A man at the grain shed, Mr. Obadiah Stull, 71, who wore his coat collar up and spoke around a pipe, looked her over once and asked where she was going. She said Cold Ash Landing. He was quiet for a moment, then said it was 9 miles up the rock road, and that nobody had gone up that way to stay in a good number of years. She asked if there was water on the road. He said there was a spring at the 4-mile mark, good year-round. She thanked him, filled her canteen at the pump behind the grain shed, put the bag across her body so the draw knife rode against her ribs, and started up the rock road into the trees. The walk took most of the afternoon. The road climbed by long, slow grades that didn't look like climbing until she glanced back and saw how far down the railway line had fallen. The wind in the spruce made a low, constant sound, like the inside of a shell. She stopped at the spring, drank, refilled the canteen, rested 5 minutes sitting on a granite shelf with her hand through the canvas on the draw knife's handle. Then she walked on. She knew Cold Ash Landing the moment she came around a bend in the road and saw the creek. A dark line of cedar and tamarack ran along it, still holding some color against the November gray, and in a shallow clearing on the east bank she saw the buildings. A cooperage of limestone and squared timber, solid in its walls but with the roof cedar gone gray and lifting at the ridge. A cottage behind it of the same limestone, a single chimney, 4 windows, 2 sound and 2 boarded. And between them, a stone-walled yard where a hand pump stood, and the ground was still clear of brush to a circle of perhaps 20 feet, as though someone had kept it worked until not so very long ago. She walked down to it slowly. The cooperage she looked at first, because it was the building she understood. 2 heavy doors still on their hinges, both sagging but not fallen. She lifted the iron latch, good ironwork, a local blacksmith's mark on the hinge plate, and pushed the right door open and stood in the entrance and let her eyes adjust. The shaving horses were still there, 2 of them, set back from the light, their jaws open, the treadles worn smooth. A coopering mold for a standard barrel hanging on the wall, the crow's cutter on its peg, stave blanks in a rack along the north wall, under a canvas that had rotted through in places but had kept the middle section of timber dry. A forge for hoop work, cold but intact, the bellows still hanging above it. She stood there for a long time. Then she went to look at the cottage. The front door opened on a latch she had to work twice before it gave. Inside, 1 main room with a plank floor, gone silver gray, a stone hearth, a pine table, 2 chairs, a shelf of tinware. A back room behind a curtain, rope bed frame without a mattress, a cedar chest painted blue and cracked at the lid. The smell was dust and cold cedar and mice and the clean mineral smell of a stone building that has never been damp. She paced the room, 14 feet by perhaps 15. She stood at the window and looked at the cooperage and thought about what could be done and in what order. Then she went to the hand pump in the yard and worked it. 10 pulls before it ran, and then it ran brown for 30 seconds before clearing to cold and clean. She drank from her cupped palm. She went back inside and began to sweep. She made a broom from birch twigs she cut from a fallen branch in the yard, bound with a strip of the rotted canvas from the cooperage. She swept for 90 minutes, carrying dust and debris out in a tin pail she found under the table. She scrubbed the table down to pale wood with sand and water. She scrubbed the hearthstone and the stone surround. And it was while she was scrubbing the surround, working along the mortar between the courses of stone, that she noticed it. The mortar at the base of the chimney breast, where the hearthstone met the firebox surround, was a different color from the mortar to either side of it, not different by much, but enough, and it had been set with a finger rather than a pointing tool, and not leveled, as though whoever had done it had worked in low light, or in a hurry, or both. She thought of what Rowena Gilchrist used to say. Look at a broken thing long enough, and it will tell you what actually happened to it. She fetched the draw knife from her bag. Its blade was not designed for mortar, but the tang was iron and the bevel was sharp. She worked the tip carefully into the seam at the base and pressed down slowly, feeling for the give. The mortar crumbled in dry, powdery flakes, freshly mixed, not cured long. A few minutes of careful work and the seam opened along its length. She set the draw knife down. She put both hands flat under the front edge of the hearthstone and lifted. It came up in one piece. Heavy, perhaps 60 pounds, maybe more, and she leaned it against the wall and stood a moment before she looked into the cavity beneath. A brick-lined space, 6 inches deep, perhaps 2 feet across. Inside, a tin box with a hinged lid, painted with a faded pattern of blue flowers, and beside the box an oilcloth bundle tied with waxed twine. She lifted the bundle first. Inside the oilcloth was a leather pouch, and inside the pouch was money. Gold coin. She counted them twice, 24 double eagles, stacked carefully. A smaller drawstring bag of silver dollars, 38 of them, and folded flat beneath, a bank check on the Bank of Toronto branch in Orangeville, made out to bearer for $175. She sat down on the floor with her back against the hearth. She set her hands on her knees. She looked at the tin box for a long moment before she opened it. Inside the box, a letter, 4 pages, written in a small, careful hand on ruled paper. Beneath the letter, a tintype photograph. 2 women, one perhaps 30, one much older, standing in summer before the Cooperage doors, and beneath the tintype, wrapped in a square of flannel, a draw knife. She lifted the cloth and unfolded it. Sheffield blade, 14 inches. Wooden handles wrapped at the grip in black linen tape. A small notch worn into the left handle, smooth at the edges, as though it had been there a long time. The twin of the one in her bag, down to the tape, down to the notch. She lifted both draw knives and held them in her lap, one in each hand, and felt the room go entirely still around her. After a long while, she took up the letter and turned toward the window to read it. The letter began, "To whoever comes after. My name is Sophronia Hatch, and I have kept this place for 39 years. She read it through once without moving. Then she read it again, aloud in a low voice, as though the empty room deserved to hear it. Sophronia Hatch's careful hand told her that Sophronia had come to Cold Ash Landing in 1882 with her husband, a cooper, and their daughter. That the husband had died in 1890, and the daughter had gone south to marry. That Sophronia had stayed because she knew coopering, and the work was there, and she was not made for depending on anyone else's generosity. That in the summer of 1899, a timber company out of Toronto, she named it, and named the man who had come to speak for it, and named the county official who had received what she called, in her careful hand, an inducement, had purchased a section of land 12 miles upstream and, in the course of their logging operations, diverted a tributary of Cold Ash Creek to improve their log run. That the diversion had raised the water table in the lower creek bottom and made the Cooperage yard flood each spring, ruining any green timber stored at grade. That the company had arranged with certain parties in the county office at Owen Sound to have Cold Ash Landing removed from the active assessment roll, so that no claim on the flooding could be brought against them. That the families had gone, 6 of them, over 3 years, and that Sophronia had stayed, because she was old, and because the cottage sat on ground 2 feet higher than the Cooperage yard, and the flooding, though it ruined the barrel storage, did not reach the cottage door. That she had set aside, from 39 years of careful work, what she could manage, for whoever came after, and that she had folded beneath the tintype a page from the original township survey, with the old creek course marked in red ink, and the diversion shown in black, and the timber company's name, and the county official's name written in the margin in her own hand, so that if anyone ever came who was willing to carry the paper to Toronto, the record might be set straight. Petra found the survey page, small and folded tight, tucked beneath the tintype. She spread it flat on the table beside the letter and the 2 draw knives and the photograph of the 2 women standing before the Cooperage doors in summer. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went out to the porch and stood in the cold air and looked at the light on the cedars along the creek. And she understood, without needing to reason through it, that she was not going to leave. She slept that first night rolled in her coat, on the floor of the back room, the draw knife from her bag held loosely in her hand. In the morning she started. She mended the cottage door on its lower hinge with a screw from the Cooperage ironwork rack. She chinked the north wall with clay from the creek bank, mixed with dry grass pulled from the yard's edge. She fixed the broken leg of the pine table with a length of ash from the stave rack, planed to the right dimension with the draw knife, and pegged with a nail she straightened on the hearthstone. On the 3rd day, a woman came down the road on a gray mare and stopped at the yard gate without dismounting until Petra came out. Her name was Cressida Hawk. She said it plainly. The way people who live alone for long stretches have learned to introduce themselves, as if the name itself is the handshake. She was 53, ran a sheep farm 4 miles east, and had seen the smoke from the cottage chimney and ridden over to see who was burning wood at Cold Ash Landing. Petra told her name and showed her the deed. Cressida read it carefully, handed it back, and asked whether she meant to stay. Petra said she did. Cressida was quiet for a moment. Then she said that the flooding in the Cooperage yard came from a creek diversion 12 miles upstream, and that everyone for 20 miles around knew whose timber company had paid to have it done, and nobody had been surprised when the county stopped acknowledging the place, only disgusted. She said she would send her son over on Saturday with a cartload of split maple. He came. Cressida's son, a young man named Rufus Quaid, 19, who had his mother's directness and a strong back, stacked the maple along the east wall of the Cooperage without being asked, and helped Petra hang the Cooperage doors properly on their hinges before he drove the cart home. The following week, Mr. Obadiah Stull from Canallan arrived on foot with his nephew and a bag of oats, and the two of them spent an afternoon helping Petra clear the debris from the Cooperage floor and stack the salvageable stave timber under the sound section of canvas. Before he left, Obadiah told her that there had been 4 families at Cold Ash Landing when the flooding started, and that 2 of them were still within 20 miles, and that people had long memories in that part of the country. Petra wrote to the Provincial Land Registry in Toronto in the 4th week, enclosing a clean copy of Sophronia Hatch's survey page, the names from the margin, and a careful letter of her own, asking that the removal of Cold Ash Landing from the Grey County Assessment Roll in 1901 be examined. She paid the postage from the silver dollars and kept the gold in the tin box under a loose board. Beneath the bed, the hearthstone mortared back with fresh mix, she pressed smooth with the handle of the draw knife. By the end of the 2nd month, the cottage had a swept floor, an amended table, and a fire she kept through the nights against the January cold. And above the hearth, on 2 iron nails she drew from the Cooperage rack, she hung the 2 draw knives side by side. Hers on the left, the blade worn to a working silver, the tape on the handles gone soft with use, the notch in the left handle holding its shadow the way it always had. Sophronia's on the right, the tape still stiff, the blade brighter at the edge, the notch in the same handle, the same shadow. Between them, she hung the tintype of the 2 women standing before the Cooperage doors in summer. Every morning before she went out to work, she stopped and put her hand against each one in turn. By early spring, Cressida Hawk was bringing cheese wrapped in cloth whenever she rode over, and staying to drink tea at the pine table and tell Petra what was being said at Kinallan and at the township office in Flesherton. What was being said was that a Dunmore girl, a Gilchrist girl, some of the older families said, knowing her mother's people, had walked into Cold Ash Landing in November and appeared to be staying. A man named Mr. Pemberton Scaff, 67, who had been one of the 4 displaced families and was now working rented land near Eugenia, drove his wagon over in March and stood in the Cooperage doorway for a long time before he said that his father had built the shaving horses in this room in 1884, and they were better horses than any he'd seen since. He stayed 2 days and helped Petra repair the Cooperage roof, and before he left, he wrote his name and the date on the inside of the cottage door frame in pencil and told her to do the same for everyone who helped, so that the place would keep its own record. Petra did, and the names grew. A letter came from Toronto in April acknowledging receipt of her papers and stating that a clerk had been assigned to review the 1901 assessment removal. A second letter came in June, shorter, more carefully worded, as official letters of significance tend to be, stating that the removal had been found procedurally irregular, that Cold Ash Landing would be restored to the county roll at the next revision, and that certain matters regarding the creek diversion had been referred to the appropriate provincial authority. Petra folded both letters into the tin box with Sophronia's letter and the survey page, and set the tin back under the floorboard. She was working the shaving horse by June, the draw knife pulling long, clean strokes down white oak staves she'd bought from a mill in Flesherton. The first barrel she finished, she sold to a farmer who needed it for pickling, and she entered the payment in her notebook in 2 columns the way Rowena had taught her, and the columns balanced. Cressida Hawk's son Rufus began stopping in on his way to and from Canallan. He had a quiet competence with tools that Petra found useful, and she suspected someone had taught him carefully. He learned the shaving horse in an afternoon and the crow's cutter in a week, and by midsummer he was working beside her 3 days out of 5, without either of them having formally arranged it. She paid him fair wages and kept it in the ledger. Mr. Pemberton's Scaff came back in July with his wife, who brought seedlings for the kitchen garden and helped Petra re-chink the Cooperage south wall. Before they left, they told her that another of the displaced families, a couple who'd been tenant farming near Meaford, had asked whether there was room to come back, and then another family after them. The flooding in the Cooperage yard, it turned out, had never been more than a seasonal inconvenience once you knew how to manage it. The timber company, under provincial inquiry, had quietly agreed to restore the original channel. It would take years, but a drainage swale along the west edge of the yard, which Rufus dug in a day and a half with a shovel and a good eye for grade, sent the spring water harmlessly to the lower creek. The yard was workable. On an evening in early November, almost exactly 1 year since she had stepped down from the train at Kinallen, into the cold and the pine smell and the silence, Petra sat in the chair she had mended and placed near the fire and watched the lamplight move on the cottage wall above the hearth. The wind outside was easy that night, a resting wind, and the cedar along the creek was tapping softly against itself in a way she had come to find companionable. The 2 draw knives hung on their nails above the hearth. She stood and went to them and laid her hand against each one in turn, the way she did each morning. She thought, without wanting to dwell on it, of Merle Dunmore's sideboard drawer. In the 8 weeks the letter had lain there. She thought of the nephew in Peterborough who had sold the stone house and the tools, and told her there was nothing further. She thought of these things clearly, and without particular heat. They had looked at her and seen a girl who could be made use of until the use ran out. They had been wrong about that, and their wrongness did not require any answer from her now. The answer was the Cooperage, with the shaving horses her hands had learned, and the stave rack filling slowly, and the ledger balanced in the notebook on the shelf. The answer was the names on the inside of the doorframe that had passed the latch and begun working their way up the jamb. The answer was Rufus Quaid knowing the sound of a well-set crows, and Mr. Pemberton Scafie's wife's seedlings in the kitchen garden waiting for spring, and a tin box under a floorboard that held, along with the money and the survey page, a letter from a woman who had kept a fire burning in this cottage for 39 years so that whoever came after would not have to start from cold. She thought of Rowena Gilchrist, who had walked 3 streets and knocked on a door for the sake of a child she barely knew, who had put a draw knife in her hands at 17 and said a good tool wants to be used by someone who knows how, who had never once, in 7 years, said anything to suggest that Petra was less than she was. And she thought of Sophronia Hatch, whom she had never seen, who had stayed in this cottage after everyone else had gone, keeping the shaving horses and the survey map and 2 draw knives and a sum of careful savings, all of it for whoever came after, who had never known Petra's name and had somehow, through a chain of connections neither of them could have drawn on a map, left her exactly what she needed to begin. 2 women, she thought, who had each spent their lives giving what they had to someone they would never see grow into it. Between them, they had made her. On the pine table lay the Cooperage ledger, open to the week's accounts. Beside it, 2 tin cups still warm, because Rufus Quaid was walking back from Kinallen and would come in from the cold before long, and she had left the fire good and the kettle on. From the yard came the low voice of the creek, moving under its skim of ice, and somewhere east along the road, the bells of Cressida Hawk's sheep settling for the night. Petra Dunmore was 21 years old, and then she was 22. She had left Owen Sound with $14 in her bag and a draw knife against her ribs and a deed to a place no map would show her. She had spent 12 of those $14 getting there. It was the best $12 she ever spent. If this story sat with you the way a November fire does, slow to start, steady once it catches, we hope you'll subscribe to Cottage Stories and share it with someone who has been told that what they were left behind was nothing worth having. Because sometimes the thing the world cannot see the value in is the very thing that carries you the rest of the way home. And while you're in the comments tonight, we'd like to ask you something. Who is the Rowena Gilchrist in your own life? The person who walked across town, or drove an hour, or wrote a letter, because they could see something in you that you hadn't yet learned to see in yourself. And what did they leave in your hands that you still pick up and use? We'll be reading. Pull up a chair and stay a while.